everyone, it's Tom here, and today we're taking a final look at Assassin's Creed 3 Remastered. Now this time I'm running through the pros and cons of every platform, including the Xbox family of machines and the maxed out PC experience. After all, Ubisoft really went to town on this one, and it deserves some attention. The reworked textures, effects, higher crowd density, and the use of physically based lighting all stack up to a bigger change than you might have expected. But the technical tweaks also extend to the second part of the package, with AC Liberation running with a different resolution and frame rate setup to the main game. More on that later. Now this is a console focused analysis, but I really wanted to see how the game ran in the best case. So here's the PC version to give you exactly that. On the left is the original version running at 4K and maxed out, while on the right we have the remastered edition, again 4K and maxed out. So this lays bare pretty much every settings upgrade, from the physically based lighting to the texture reworking. And on top of that, we also have subtle enhancements to the post-effect suite as well, like the bloom and depth of field are improved, plus we get things like screen space reflections on water, which weren't present in the original. Actually, along with the PBR, these reflections mark one of the bigger changes in the package. If you go to the original game, all these water bodies are left completely bare by comparison, and if we switch over to the remastered, yeah, you're getting a lot more for your money here. Also worth noting is the remaster settings menu is massively overhauled to let you tweak everything now. It's quite unlike the original game where you had to go to the directory and then find an ini file and tweak that to change the resolution. Unbelievably, that's what I actually had to do to get this running at 4K. Whereas on the remaster, it's all updated to run exactly as you'd expect, and all those parameters are right at your fingertips. So with that good news out of the way, let's look at the consoles and see how close they can get to the 4K maxed out experience. And obviously the first port of call is the Xbox One X. If any of the consoles stand a chance, it's probably this one. But alas, what we're getting is a native 3200 by 1800. You do get screen space reflections, as does every console. But in terms of the native res setup, we're not quite there at 4K, but it still looks good. Certainly compared to the base Xbox One, which we'll move to next, which you can immediately tell is running at a much lower res. It's 1600 by 900, which means X is running at 4 times the pixel count overall. Now if we carry on over to the PlayStation 4 side, on the base PS4 we're getting 1080p, while on the PS4 Pro it's actually running at 2688 by 1512. So apologies, that's a correction to my initial analysis. But yes, it's running at 1512p all the way through the main game. But with that said, the pursuit of a native 4K comes much closer to bear in the AC Liberation side of the package. So on Xbox One X, we do get a native 4K, 3840 by 2160, which you might expect given this has origins as a Vita title. This is obviously improved with much better assets and textures, and in general, the whole lighting model's been revamped since the original release, but fundamentally the geometry and the design of the game feels very much based on that level of hardware, and that seems to have helped the conversion process to getting this running at 4K on X. Whereas if we look at PS4 Pro next, what we're getting here is slightly unusual. It seems to be a native 4K in parts. Aspects of the geometry are a clear one-to-one match for a 4K capture, but what you also have is a kind of stippling effect. It seems to give you double width pixels horizontally on some edges, meaning it should come in at 1920 by 2160 if it is indeed reconstructing from a lower res. Though on both enhanced machines, the X and the Pro, you're going to see some very odd limitations with this one. There's a dithering effect to buildings too far away, almost like a fade-in transition effect as we move closer to them. It's in all likelihood a carryover from the days when it was made for a handheld, where you couldn't push so many polygons all in one scene. But it is worth noting that stippling effect on buildings is a bit more noticeable on PS4 Pro. Meanwhile, if we look at the base consoles for Liberation, it's just a straight native 1080p on both. So we're getting an upgrade on every machine, though PS4 Pro is still shy of the image quality possible on X here. It's worth stressing the resolution metrics here because visually speaking there's not a lot between them otherwise. You're getting, as I mentioned, the screen space reflections across the board, and if we look at the main game, the textures, effects and character models are identical between every machine. Now there are some exceptions. The post-effects suite is lower resolution on the base Xbox One compared to X, so if we look at these two platforms side by side, you can see there's more of a stair-stepping to the bloom there around the glow stick as we go down into the cave. But besides that, you're really getting a lot on the base console compared to X, and not much in the way of a high-res texture pack is really reserved for the higher-end consoles. What's interesting here is when you install it on Xbox One X, say if you transfer the game data over from a base Xbox One using an external hard drive, you're immediately required to download an extra 5 GB of data. Now, from what I've seen, there are no texture upgrades, but I can hazard a guess that the extra 5 GB goes towards the early pre-rendered cinematics, which would obviously look a lot better at 4K, and so in all likelihood that's where it's going. But otherwise the presets used on console are identical, even down to the shadow mapping and the filtering cascade on shadows. It's very near to the player, and you can see this sort of cascade line as you walk ahead. It's a bit of a shame we're not getting more on X and Pro in this respect, but there we go. At least from the perspective of the base consoles, you're not really missing out on much. All of which leads us to the performance side. Now, I figure the more interesting comparison here would be between the base consoles first, because it turns out Xbox One's cut to 900p isn't quite enough to mitigate some of the more egregious drops. In my first analysis on PS4, I did note that the game largely played at 30 FPS with VSync engaged as well. What we get on Xbox One is quite unlike that. You're getting drops into the 20s even while running around in like the Boston Harbor area, and on top of that you have an adaptive VSync as well, which means the screen can tear about in the top 25% of the screen. Anything more than that and it drops a frame. So interestingly, that's also how the Xbox One X version runs as well, with an adaptive VSync, but you'll be hard pressed to find it given how well that version runs. So yeah, by comparison, Xbox One is struggling to get even the basics of gameplay running smoothly as you're just running through a town. A bit of a shame, and it happens just as much while going for character close-ups in cutscenes, where there's a lot more post effects going on in the background, depth of field, and the overall impression is this game really was geared towards the base PS4 first, and then that version was upscaled and improved for the enhanced consoles, where again, the base Xbox One seems to be trailing behind in terms of what it can actually do. Next up, let's move over to the enhanced consoles. Now interestingly, PS4 Pro is trailing here when we go for the same stress points. So for example, that close-up of Hatham during the auditorium scene, it seems to really tank performance on Pro. Not sure why, because gameplay generally runs much better. It's like 30 FPS for a lot of the Boston Harbor, lots of the intensive running around and high geometry, high NPC density areas here, but in this one cutscene where you get a close-up of his face, that's where it plummets, and it does notably more than the X hardware. Fortunately, PS4 Pro is much smoother during regular gameplay, so it's nothing to worry about in that sense. It's just that in principle, the frame rates do go a lot lower on PS4 Pro than you might expect. The curious thing to note here is PS4 Pro runs with VSync engaged, so basically if it's going to drop, it's going to drop a frame. Whereas in the rare instances Xbox One X's performance takes a hit, you'll sooner see a couple of tears first before any single frame drop. So overall, these two are pretty good ways to play. The only outlier really is the base Xbox One, where performance drops will stand out, even to the regular passerby. What about Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation? Given the high resolutions in this game, there's actually not much to talk on in performance. It's actually running pretty well on every platform, the exception being the base Xbox One, where you're going to get drops to the 20s again. The difference is this time, VSync is actually engaged on all platforms, so no tearing whatsoever. So we're running the base Xbox One here as an example of that. Whereas if we move over to the base PS4, you can see much of it is cleared up in the same spot as we run through. So really, it's only one platform that's severely affected. But for the rest of Liberation's opening act, I've noticed performance is much better than Assassin's Creed 3 in general. So there is good news there. All of this calls into question how the Switch version will compare, because obviously the Assassin's Creed series has notoriously always been a CPU hog, and also with the extra effects and PBR added to the remaster, we're looking at a toll on these consoles' GPUs as well. So how this translates to the Tegra X1 architecture of the Switch remains to be seen, and we'll have more news on that as it comes out next month in May. But as a summary of the fortunes of the console versions already out, that's all I've got today. Just a quick follow-up, if you did find this useful or interesting in any way, please give us a like or subscribe. and don't forget to hit the bell to get notifications as any video lands. To see this video at its source file quality, be sure to check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.